Hello, welcome to episode 4 of Conservation Conversations. I'm out here in the greenhouse to do the introduction because, as you'll see, I had serious backdrop envy from today's speaker. So we're going to the Ecuadorian cloud forests today, to an absolutely amazing environment, to hear from Holger Beck. Now, I visited this location in 2014 and with a bunch of students, and it was the most incredible environment, one of the most incredible places I've ever visited. It's a high altitude rainforest and the nature there is incredible. The butterflies, the snakes, the hummingbirds, the spiders, all right there for you to access. The incredible views from the lodge. It's genuinely a rainforest in which you can get altitude sickness. The dawns are spectacular, where you're in these islands of forest above the cloud. Now, Holger covers the spec absolutely brilliantly in this main video, but as with all the other speakers, he went far beyond what I could have expected and provided huge amounts of information and insight in areas not specifically linked to the specification, particularly in his case something we've not had before in terms of personal qualities, leadership, project management, and what you need to be a success, not just in conservation but in any field of endeavour that you choose. So I highly recommend that. Do go and have a look. Now, of course, given where he is, the internet coverage isn't going to be the best, so there were a few technical issues, which you'll see with the video quality in terms of the Zoom call. Do sort of bear with that. That's obviously a minor issue when you consider the wealth of knowledge that he's providing for us. Okay, so I'll hand you now straight over to Holger Beck in the cloud forests of Ecuador.
Yes, so thanks for inviting me to this. My name is Holger Beck. I'm from Germany, but I've been living in Ecuador, in this part of Ecuador, for the last 10 years. We're here in the northwestern part of Ecuador, northwest of Quito, about 40 kilometers from the capital, in an area that's extremely biodiverse, right inside of the cloud forest, actually, at an elevation of about 1,200 meters right now. I've been working here in two different reserves, mainly as a guide, but also in scientific research. And apart from the more or less professional stuff I'm doing, I'm also involved in an environmental group that's called the Committee of the Bears Corridor. So we're doing
Okay.
lots of environmental work, lots of projects on the side there as well.
Great. So, of course, I've visited that area of the world, and it is one of the most wonderful parts of the world to visit, to go and see, in terms of if you like your nature. But can you perhaps explain to everybody why it is, from your perspective, that Santa Lucia and cloud forest, specifically this wonderful environment, are so important in terms of their wildlife and their environment?
Yes. So cloud forest is basically um, montane rainforest. So
Mm.
rainforest that's somewhere up in the mountains, and the key characteristic, as the name implies, is that it's often covered with clouds. So, and the clouds are not somewhere above, in 1 or 2 kilometers. They're hanging right in the forest, right in the trees. So the reason for that is that we get lots of moist air coming in from the Pacific Ocean,
Yep.
and when it's driven against the Andes here, then of course the air has to rise, and at some point it will not enough energy to hold all the water, and clouds form. At some point it's going to rain, and this is a very special ecosystem for two reasons. First of all, the clouds, so the high humidity that we almost constantly have up there in the trees, allows for lots of epiphytic growth.
Yeah.
So we are true hotspot for certain types of epiphytes, like orchids, for instance, that absorb moisture from these clouds through their roots into the plant. So they don't need to be rooted in the ground.
For my
Mhm.
students' benefit, an epiphyte obviously is a plant growing on another plant. Would you say, is that a reasonable definition?
Yes, yes, that's exactly. So we're a hotspot for these epiphytic plants. So orchids just one example. Most plant families we have here, even palm trees and trees, are growing as epiphytes.
Mm.
So it's probably difficult to see that, but even a lemon tree, I got some behind me. I got some orchids hanging around.
Yeah.
So this is the one thing why it's so biodiverse. So simply this moisture that's in the air that the plants can use. And the other thing, since we're here in the mountains, in a rather young mountain, so you get lots of structural complexity in the topography. So you have lots of small ravines, lots of streams, lots of mountain slopes that are exposed to different sites, get different amount of sunlight, different amounts of rain. So um, technically, we're part of the Choco Andean biodiversity hotspot, which is here in
Yeah.
northwestern South America, and particularly the cloud forests, since they're also, first of all, it's rather small ecosystem. So if you look at the map, there's vast areas of tropical lowland rainforest, or where it was, whereas the cloud forests or tropical or the montane rainforests, should be the correct term, are rather small band.
Yeah.
So and so we have a high diversity really condensed on a rather small area. The Santa Lucia Reserve stretches on a very small area. Actually, it's only 730 hectares large, so it's rather small for a reserve, but it stretches from 1,400 meters above sea level to 2,500. You can walk this in one day, and you get lower subtropical rainforest, upper subtropical rainforest, and you get even temperate forest up there. So even in terms of climate zones, of vegetation zones, you get on a very small within a very small area, you get lots of diversity, also elevation wise. That's true.
Brilliant. So the Santa Lucia Lodge specifically for me is one of the most remarkable sort of examples of ecotourism I think I've ever seen. So in terms of using ecotourism for conservation purposes, could you explain what ecotourism means to you? What is it to you, and how is it deployed in Santa Lucia to further conservation?
So ecotourism is, of course, a branch of tourism that tries to lower the impact on the environment as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole range of aspects that you have to try to take into consideration. Starting with transportation. So Santa Lucia, you cannot reach by car. So there is a parking spot, of course, but you still have to walk in. So these parts of the forest are at least protected from contamination. We use mules to bring up the luggage from the parking spot to the lodge.
I remember it well. Shakira the mule taking my bag up to the top there.
She's still out there.
She's still going.
You also have things like how you produce your energy, how you use energy. This is something where we still have to work in Santa Lucia. So the official thing is, although we do have some solar panels, there's no electricity.
Okay.
Although we have done some research into that, we have not found a long-term sustainable way of creating enough energy to provide electricity to our guests and also to the staff all the time. Use of water. So for at least for the main lodge only has composting toilets, so we don't need any water to flush the toilet. But it's a very environmental friendly way of storing whatever human energy is left in what we excrete, and turn it back into proper soil. Another aspect is the food production. So ideally on ecotourism sites, either you produce your own food, which is difficult in some climates, but we do have our own organic garden there. And or you buy local or regional food. So it's very important to keep transportation costs low. You also don't want to cause lots of contamination, neither in the water nor in the soil. So since we're sitting on a mountaintop, we're also protecting or the lodge at least, sitting on a mountaintop. We try to protect all the river running through Santa Lucia, because that's at the end of the day are the rivers that many people in the surrounding areas and further below are still using as drinking water, if not for themselves, then for their animals. And another aspect that is how you work with nature. So we're pretty strict on staying on the trails. So we don't let our guests run off into the forest wherever they want to. So it's just another way to keep the impact low on our own environment.
And it's actually one of the main reasons you alluded to there that I wanted to speak to you, of all the people, all the places that have been with students, was about the food and about how you run this incredible lodge. So our students are asked to know about conflicts and working with farmers in biologically sensitive areas. So in your experience of looking at the Santa Lucia Lodge and the region around it, you've mentioned there using local food to feed guests and that kind of thing, and having your own organic gardens and things. Can you think of any examples in your region where farmers and other people have come in, conservationists have come into conflict, and some examples maybe in terms of the lodge where they're working well together?
Well, in terms of the conflicts, I don't know where to start.
Okay.
humans, we need food, simply.
Yeah.
So we need agriculture, unless in the future we want to live off pure chemicals or being fed by the chemical industry. So if you look at the map, if you look at the whole region from above, you'll see that agriculture actually was in the past the main driver for the loss of forest.
Yeah.
So there's huge chunks of the area, although Nanegal, so the particular parish where Santa Lucia is located, where I live, is still pretty foresty, but this is for other reasons. Big parts have been lost to agriculture, mainly livestock. So we
Yeah.
have lots of cattle around. Sugarcane, cassava is big, and at least when these things were originally set up, they were not set up in a let's say environmental friendly way. The
Mm.
forest was simply cut, hectares and hectares of the forest were cut. Grass was planted for cows and bulls, and elsewhere sugarcane was planted or
Yeah.
whatever else crops people have here. And usually, one has to say monoculture,
Yes.
and often crops were brought in that were not originally from here. And naturally, because nature is kind of fighting back, trying to
Yeah.
sustain itself, so you have lots of pests. So then people, of course, started working lots with pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, all these things, which cause a high level of contamination in the rivers, but also in the food itself.
Yeah.
So many local people actually are not willing to eat their own naranjilla. So naranjilla is a tiny little plant in the nightshade family, very, very tasty. It's good for desserts, good for juices, but the mass production that we have here in this area basically all goes to Quito, because there's so
Right.
much poison in it that local people are really
Oh,
kind of
okay. So they've got
suspect.
their
But
own they've got their own special supplies somewhere that they think are
well,
particularly
they got their one or
untouched.
two plants in the
Yeah.
backyards that they can eat from peacefully. But if you want to grow it in big scale, then you need these insecticides or pesticides.
Wow. So
Um,
the
so
difference between what they eat and commercial farming is really stark, you would say.
yes,
Wow.
it's not necessarily the same for sugarcane and these other things that are a bit hardier. But for Nankia, I know it. I've been told. And the other thing is something that, for instance, happened in Santa Lucia a lot when they were still farmers until the early 90s.
Hmm.
That if when you have a hectare of Naranjilla or tree tomato production, and then the pests, of course, get resistant at some point to the pesticides, something that also happened, then you need to go to another part of the forest, ideally far away from where you were, and cut it and start growing crops there.
Yeah.
So the way agriculture was done here traditionally is not sustainable. Um,
Okay.
and so this is the one conflict: contamination and loss of forest. And what we have been seeing over the last years now, because parts of the forest are protected, so Santa Lucia, Maki the whole
Yep.
forest band is protected by law. So, but there's this border we have with agriculture, so we get lots of conflict with wildlife too.
Mm.
So say bears, the Andean
Yep.
bear that we hear, they leave the forest because there's a sugarcane field right outside,
Yeah.
and so it's basically a good trap for them. And the farmers can't afford to lose their sugarcane, so there have been occasionally killings of bears.
Yeah.
There's of course always reports, although we don't know whether they're necessarily true, of pumas that we also have in the forest that also go into or leave the forest and go on the farms and then feed on of domestic animals, yeah,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
are basically also easy catch for
Yeah.
them, so they
Easy
don't have to
pickings.
run after a wild animal. Yeah. We have all sorts of problems with smaller animals, rodents that go into farms, whether they're shot because supposedly they're damaging also the sugarcane or the cassava.
Yeah.
So the conflict issue is a rather big one that we're currently working on through education.
I do remember on the flip side though some really nice relationships in that area. I remember specifically a mill, a mule powered sugarcane mill just down the hill from the Santa Lucia Reserve. We actually worked press ganged into helping bring some of the sugar back up to the lodge. Um, that seemed like a good relationship. But can you think of any other examples of particularly good relationships between conservationists and agriculturalists that you've got in your area?
Sure. I mean, simply accepting the fact that we need agriculture, there's a demand for those products. There are some projects in this area, but also in other parts of Ecuador that I know of, to turn agriculture into more environmental friendly enterprises.
Yeah.
So thinking of organic agriculture, it works without pesticides, at least without chemicals. Yeah? So chemical insecticide, pesticides, because you still need pest control. There's also a project in this area to even make uh, pastures, livestock production, more environmental friendly. And then there's, of course, kind of a demand of tourists, not only to see the forest, but also to see the cultural side of this part
Mm.
of the world. And then what you mentioned, bringing them to a sugarcane field, showing them how the canes are grinded and how the sugar is produced, is a way of where ecotourism, conservation, and agriculture go hand in hand. So
Yeah.
then let's say if the farmers have an extra income through tourism, then they may not be so forced to squeeze the last thing out of their plants and to take the next hectare of forest because
Yeah.
yeah, just to make a living, right? Of course, for profit you could always have more and more and more, but let's see at least this to make a living. They can probably settle with producing less if they have this extra source of income. And also something that is often underestimated, I mentioned this in tourism, is just to have foreigners coming in on your land and paying to see something that you do for a living. Either it's protecting a forest or it's making sugarcane, already makes local people often think about what they have. It's not only
Yeah.
the pure sugar, or not only exactly what they sell in the market, how much money they get for it, but there's more to it. Yeah, to give them this creativity of thinking about, okay, what else could I do to make a little to make a living. You know?
You allude there to the people know. I mean, they know that practices that they're doing are damaging their environment. So you mentioned your agriculturists in the area sending the heavily pesticided fruits to Quito rather than eating them themselves. So they know these things are damaging to their environment. And I suspect I'm going to get the same answer I've had from many other people to this question. So why, in your experience, do you think people do damage their own environments when they're obviously very attached to them? They know that these things are damaging. So what's the main driver, do you think, behind people damaging their own environment?
Yeah. So one thing that especially environmentalists have to understand, at least in my opinion, it's always collateral damage.
Yeah.
Nobody I know goes out and say, I earn my money by destroying the environment.
Yeah.
It's always something they feel, or mostly that they have to do because they think they need to do it to make a living. When they open pastures, because I think they need to produce meat or milk for the market. It's the way how they feed their families. And then the forest just doesn't, or the natural ecosystems don't have the priority.
Mm.
So this is the one thing where really the pressures on the people, it's what most people will say. But
Yeah.
partly it's, say let's say the pesticide thing could also be a lack of education. Or they love the environment, they don't know that there are alternatives to chemical pest control. Uh, there's something that's also carelessness might be involved, that people, it doesn't have the
Yeah.
priority, especially when I don't know, throwing litter into the environment. This is if
Yeah.
they give it a thought, they might think, okay, it's damaging, it looks ugly, but it's at that point it doesn't really matter. So, but I think that the pressure, and this is something that maybe comes up with another question, then is really by far the biggest thing. So people always say, I need to make a living. Ecotourism doesn't feed a lot of people here. So in Santa Lucia, we were 10, in Makipakuna, neighboring reserve, maybe 15, but there's 5,000 people here that need
Yeah.
to
It's
be
not
fed.
a big proportion, is it?
Yeah. So the key, probably next one, would be education, showing them that other systems, environmental friendly systems, do also work.
Mm.
Um, they could actually bring in extra money through tourism, because no tourists want to see a farmer spraying insecticides
No.
on their land, or
No.
something like that. So
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. So if we can go back to a different direction onto the research side of things. So we obviously have to teach our students about research methods and ways to gather environmental data. But usually it's a school field in the UK where they put a transect and count some daisies, which isn't very exciting. Um, can you tell us some about the data gathering methods and sort of data sets that have been gathered in Santa Lucia? Because I know you're very heavily involved in research, and then what
Yeah.
the purpose of that data is. Where does it go, and what does it lead to?
Yeah. So the data collection itself might not be too different from counting
Well,
daisies.
that's the point, that the methods are the same, but
Yeah.
it's the context that's different.
Yeah. So we have several monitoring projects going on in Santa Lucia. Some are externally, well, financed externally. So
Hmm.
external researcher comes in and say, I want to do this and this research. Then they train local people to be the field assistants. We take the data. So this, for instance, happens in a project that's been ongoing for the last 7 years, which is looking at the interactions between hummingbirds and plants, which might give us a clue on, well, but just seeing, okay, how can so many, the question is how can so many hummingbird species how can so many hummingbird species survive on such a
Yeah,
small area? Yeah, so usually in terms of evolution, one would have to kind of outcompete the others. So there would be only very few left. But we have 30 species of hummingbirds in Santa Lucia. So
yeah, they were wonderful, wonderful things. I remember the booted racket tail, and being
yes,
able to
yes,
feed it by hand with the sugar feeders. What a wonderful species.
yes, yeah. So, but understanding how can such a large diversity maintain itself? How do they partition the niches? How do they share the flowers in between themselves? Um, Understanding that the forest is not just a meadow where everything is basically just one layer, but there are
Mm,
several layers. There's so many things in the physiology and in the anatomy, no, morphology. I'm sorry,
yeah,
morphology it is of the birds and the flowers that is playing a central role, and in which hummingbird goes to which flower. Some
yeah,
hummingbirds. So these are some findings already. Now, some hummingbirds really feed in the lower layers of the forest, so between 0 and 4 meters. Others stay in the canopy, but you only find this out by taking data, by going to the forest once or twice a month, counting all the flowers, counting all the interactions you see between hummingbirds and flowers, or putting cameras to the flowers to get more data. They might share in terms of seasonal. There might be seasonal changes. There might be changes throughout the day. So all this helps us in future projects when in conservation. If we find certain species that seem to be key, that
mm,
seem to be all over the reserve, or certain flowers that attract so many hummingbird species, uh, that if you want to have hummingbirds in the forest, which are important for pollination, then you would start maybe with that species and then plant all the other species around it in order to attract diversity, in order not
yeah.
to have them competing too much. The other projects that we have um, that we do internally is, for instance, the bird monitoring. What we do there is we have about 130 points across the whole reserve at all elevations, all forest types. Where we go at least once a year, ideally several times, but minimum once a year. And for 10 minutes, we register all the birds that are present, heard and seen. And
Hmm.
what you get there is, for instance, trend data. So you can see that certain bird species that were out there in 2008 when we started the project are not present anymore.
Right.
So you could wonder why. So, I mean, we would need environmental data, which we don't have such a long term, and also
Yeah.
not on the forest growth, in order to correlate it with other things. So weather data are typically very interesting, or climate data. I think we talk about climate change a little
Yeah.
later.
Well, that's the thing about these data, is ecology data, is each individual transect might not be that exciting, but it's the long term data sets that are what you
Right,
need, isn't it? You need
right.
that data over a long, long period of time,
Yes.
which is what areas and reserves like yours are so good for, is that sort of long term research input.
And another maybe very interesting thing is the camera trapping that we've been doing.
Yes.
That is aimed at mid-sized and large mammals. So everything rat-sized up to the bears, of course, with the biggest mammal.
Hmm.
What is interesting in understanding, for instance, about the big mammals and like the bears, how do they move through the reserve?
Mm.
At what seasons they're there in order to create corridors for the large mammals. Like I think it's also a question that comes up later. We need to know, okay, where are they when? Where are they? Where exactly are their trails? Do they use random trails in the forest? Do they, I don't know, move randomly just to arrive at a certain point, or can we actually protect a lot of them?
Yeah.
If we only knew that at least huge percentage of the population we have is moving through a certain area. So this will become then a critical area for conservation. So this is a very practical outcome of the project.
If you've got this long-term data set and you've identified from very rigorously that there's an issue in a particular area, so on and so forth, and you know there's a problem, you know what the problem is, what do you think is the most successful form of conservation? What does really successful conservation look like? Is it the formation of more reserves? Is it something more sociological, interacting with people, or what? What's the best, in your experience, way to achieve conservation goals?
So if you look at the last 30 years and how actually these remaining forests here were protected, and if it wasn't, I have to say, for the Makipukuna Foundation, which started this like 30 a bit years ago, there would be no forest left between here and Quito. So the critical thing, what they did, is just buying a huge chunk of land, and then getting for their own land and for the surrounding land. So they created a protected area, protected by law, by the government.
Yeah.
And so the initial thing is because they need to be quick. Yes, to buy the land, and then have it protected, not only by themselves, but also by some political institutions, in this case, the Ministry of Environment. But this alone wouldn't have worked if they had not also included the surrounding communities,
of course,
and run education projects, but also very not just telling them why it's important, because like I said, the pressure on the farmers might be so big that I know that the forest is important, but more important is to have
feed
food.
my family. Yeah,
it's sad to say that, but you need some money. You need not just some money, you need quite a good amount of money, depending on the. But it's not, you don't just go to the farm and give them money. You need to teach them. So you need to invest in buying land and then education. So these seems to have been the main drivers for the protected areas that we have here.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I mean, so the next question, because about talking about building reserves and protecting areas and things like that, is about successional processes, because that's also part of our syllabus. So let's say you come up with a very effective plan to protect an area. As you say, you've involved the local communities, you've got governmental protection. Have you seen any land recover, and what does the successional process look like in cloud forests in South America, and how long does it take?
So I have not, at least in my time here, seen a forest recovering from zero to primary forest.
Well, of
so
course, yeah.
This will be too short in 10 years.
Yeah.
But the recovery of the forest, of course, depends very much on how big the land is that was logged or was destroyed, how close the next forest is. Yeah. So this because of seed dispersal. Simply, if you want a forest there, you need the seeds, and if you want the process to be natural, you need the seeds to be able to arrive. So you need proximity to a forest, and also it depends on the soil itself. If there's lots of toxins in the soil, because it was used for agriculture, it will take longer. But there's good news. So when you came to Santa Lucia, so all the way up from the parking spot to Santa Lucia, there was no forest left 35 years ago.
Wow. Okay.
For someone coming from a temperate zone, this is a forest. So if people don't point out, it's a secondary forest. It's a mature secondary forest. You get lots of cecropia trees. So the forest itself has its succession. So succession is not something, often we think succession is something man-made. It's something we cut the forest and then we think it comes back with those species first and then the next species. No, it's something the forests themselves invented. You see this every time you have a landslide. Sometimes landslides can be huge. It takes weeks or maybe months to have them green again. Small plants popping up, certain plant families, certain species that are colonizers, right? That have spread their seeds far away and then they wait in the soil just for these occasions when there's enough sunlight and conditions are right up. They produce then the soil for the next generation. So the secondary forest. So I would say you would see good secondary forest between 20 and 30 years if there's forest around. So if the seeds have a chance to disperse. The primary forest trees, of course, take a while longer, but you can see some already growing in the in those secondary forests in Santa Lucia.
Yeah.
So you can see some small trees in the Lauraceae family or Myrtaceae family, all these trees that will be huge in 200 years from now. So for them, it takes much longer. But to have a forest come back with a good part of diversity doesn't take too long if the conditions are not the worst.
Yeah, that's remarkably quick. I mean, I would not have, if you hadn't told me that was a secondary forest that we walked through up the trail to get to the lodge, I would have not known that from primary rainforest, and that only took 35 years. I just suppose
Yes,
it suppose shows how productive the land in South America around the equatorial region actually is. It's incredibly
yes,
productive land, and if you give it a chance,
right.
it'll come back.
And
So,
they say that it's actually more difficult for the forest to come back in the cloud forest because the slopes, because once the forest is cleared and you have this continuous rain that washes away probably
mm,
all the seeds, all the topsoil again. So there's lots of factors that might impact a particular region or a particular place why it grows faster here than there. But I have seen forests recovering. But what you do get, and this is really important, maybe also for your students, is it's not the primary forest. It's really true. You don't see the big trees come back first, but
yeah.
the secondary forest mostly consists of a genus is called Cecropia here. I
Hmm.
can send you a picture. They have these large lob leaves which have lots of tiny seeds. And but the good thing about many of these secondary forest trees, they already attract lots of biodiversity. Like they often produce fruit that's very attractive to birds.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and the leaves are often host or they're also often like hosts for all kinds of caterpillars or
Yeah.
butterflies. So nature has its ways to come back unless it's completely poisoned by us, uh, I'm not too worried as long as the damage is small scale. So if
Yeah.
you have like huge scale damage, what we see in the Amazon, Brazilian, Ecuador, I think Peru is also doing quite a bit of work there. To have those forests back will probably take much longer, especially
Yeah.
and one thing that forests has difficult times to fight with is pastures.
Right.
So grass is pretty well because of dense root system, yeah, absorbing all the water, all the nutrients that coming from
Yeah.
above. The trees that typically root a little deeper have a much harder time to
Yes.
grow there. So in Santa Lucia, we've made this experiment, or well, not experiment. We introduced silvo pastures. So we went from pure pastures to silvo pastures with pastures that are shade grown, where you grow some trees
Hmm.
in the pastures in order to attract a bit of wildlife, a bit of diversity.
Yeah.
And you clearly see that only very few trees have survived. So what we tried, they tried 20 to 25 different species of trees that they found the seeds in the forest, and only two actually had a chance to compete with the grasses. They're still there. You still see them in the pastures around the lodge. But even there, even in those pastures, if they're not maintained on the edges, you can see how the forest is kind of start growing back into the grass. But it takes much longer than let's say in the crops that are not native to this region. So these, if you don't attend your I don't know cassava plantation or your naranjilla or tree tomato plantation here, within a year or two, you will not see any of your plants anymore because then
Yeah.
the secondary growth is so strong and so much more adapted to the climate here that they will immediately overgrow those crops. Grass, all the grassy species, I think sugarcane, because the same family, is a bit harder to get rid of in a natural way. You cannot easily say that a secondary forest has less value
Yeah.
for nature. It is absolutely important and actually the key to have a primary forest come up afterwards. Yeah, so without secondary forest, primary forest, I dare say, would not grow. You may have the
Yeah.
occasional tree here and there in a very good place where they survive, we can survive those primary forest trees or where they can grow. But without secondary growth first, it's covering the ground, it's
Yeah.
protecting the soil, particularly from all the environmental impacts from the sun, from the rain, and then creating the topsoil then because secondary forest plants are usually much less needy in terms of soil quality, but primary forest trees do need that. They need a
Yeah.
good topsoil. They need good minerals and humus. But
Yeah.
this is produced by the secondary growth first. So this
Yeah.
is it's a key actually. It's very important.
Well, it just speaks to this idea if everyone thinks of rainforests and other ecosystems as static, this is the forest, but it's how dynamic they actually are. That all these ecosystems are dynamic systems that are constantly changing.
Right.
So,
If you just look into Santa Lucia well, we have the rainy season here from January to May, and if you just look from the lodge into the mountains across, you see at least 2 or 3 new landslides every year.
yeah,
So the landslides, they can be small, they can be, I don't know, 10 meters wide and then 50 meters long, but they can also affect the whole mountain. So suddenly there's a whole, I don't know, band of mountain, like 200 meters, 300 meters
it
downhill,
just
be
comes down.
affected by landslides. So it's normal. This turnover is really normal. Nature is prepared to fight. Actually, it needs
Yeah.
it to recover.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that feeds perfectly into our study of succession and what we have to talk about on our syllabus. So I guess getting a little bit bigger now. So talk about the whole of South America, because obviously you're, thank you very much for doing this and speaking for the entire continent. That's your role here today to talk for the whole of South America. Um,
Try my best.
yeah, but so we're talking the big sort of thing that we have to talk about is the balance, the balance between conservation and people. Now we've talked about farming and pesticides and all that kind of stuff, because as you mentioned, the people need to eat and the population's rising and it's not going anywhere. People are still going to have to eat all that kind of stuff. Is there something that you can think, some things you can think of about the best ways to balance the needs of people with the needs of conservation in South America? I mean, some things that jump to my mind might be things like beef farming and ranching in South America, feeding cattle soybeans, so soybean plantations. Obviously, you've mentioned deforestation. So, in your view, what do you think the best way to balance the needs of humans and conservationists would be?
I've been doing lots of thinking about this, of course. I mean, seeing different approaches to conservation here. I've worked in other places in Ecuador on permaculture farms on the coast. I worked in the Amazon for a while as a
Hmm.
volunteer back then. And so many people thought that ecotourism would be the way to, but the recent crisis has shown us that it's not, clearly not.
Yeah,
So I think South America suffers from a lot of political instability.
yeah,
So it goes, we think here, from left to right, which is more like conservationists or conservatives to nationalists to half left. So it's very difficult to in most countries, at least in Ecuador is a good example, to have political stability and introduce one plan of how to progress and one vision on how to move on, make people happy. Don't have to be afraid of tomorrow, of how
mm,
they get their food. So I think the approach, not on a national but on a regional scale.
yeah,
So you need to find regions that kind of fit, where you have kind of a homogeneous, maybe topography, social structure, and ideal. It's not only for South America. I would also suggest that for the rest of the world, actually, and look at how can this region be as self-sufficient as possible.
yeah,
This kind of energy production. We think of water, of food supply. You can create lots of more solidarity between people,
mm,
because the people, they have the same problems. So you're much more willing to help. You are much more willing to save the forest that's right out in front of your door than the forest that may be, I don't know,
yeah,
10,000 kilometers away. Uh,
absolutely. So,
the problem we have nowadays is really that whenever there's problems, our leaders can tell us it's us and there's them, and
yeah,
we have to take care about us first. Yeah, so it works everywhere in the world. It works and this creates fear in you and it worries. And people are easy to manipulate when they're worried, when they are fearful, when they don't know how to feed their families tomorrow. You can make them do whatever you want to if you're in that position.
yeah,
And but if people had these regional, uh, let's say, yeah, it's regional segments. The world was segmented by region rather than by nationality or by country or whatever. So where people knew each other, that they could take care of. I mean, it shouldn't lead to the situation of one region going to the other, but so the dependencies between the regions should be clear. And it should be
mm,
clear. Okay, they are helping us, we are helping them, and within ourselves. But we're not depending on any other region. We're not really, at least the food, the social standards are regional. So I know it's a huge approach. Um, but I think this would help humanity as
yeah,
such, and also all the, let's say, all the idealistic things like conservation, like education systems, like social welfare, would be a huge boost for that as well. So as long as we can be kept small by fears, by, let's say, it's us and them
yeah. I know.
approach. there will be no bigger progress.
I think that's very wise thought, and the idea of international borders, I think, is not one that's not been brought up so far in my conversations, but it's particularly acute in South America because with the Amazon and with the rainforest area covering so many
Right.
countries, I mean that kind of takes on to the next question, which was another of the projects that was being undertaken in 2014 when I was there was to build a wildlife corridor, as you've mentioned earlier. So from going north from Santa Lucia. So to the south of Santa Lucia, you saw more farmland. To the north, you had some protected areas, but you had areas of forest that were the same as the Santa Lucia and the other reserves, and they just weren't protected. And that was going up towards the Colombian border, and then the forest just went on into Colombia because it doesn't obey international borders. How is that project coming along in terms of like connecting up reserves in your area of South America? Is that going well, or working, or
Well, what what is working now is we made a smaller corridor, and a
right?
corridor with a particular topic, which is the Andean bears corridor.
Yeah,
There's not this huge corridor approach that really went from the Colombian border down to, I think the map says Pichincha. Pichincha was just outside of Quito.
yeah,
It might be geographically it's there, and also the forest is more or less protected. So there's lots of initiatives, but it's not out there officially because it also crosses province borders here in Ecuador, which is another mess. So, but we have the small approach, which is the Bears corridor, which is big enough. It's 65,000 hectares. It ranges from the Pichincha, so about 20 kilometers south of here, and 15 kilometers the other direction. But if you were to look at the map, you would actually see it's actually that band of intact forest, which is protected mostly by tourism, but also by community approach, or community conservation, which we have been able to create, where we work together actually. So this is a very important thing. So surveillance and control. And the fourth part is, of course, communication education. So how do we get this idea across? How do we connect with either the public education system or privately organized education programs to, one has to say, to wash people's brains. So
yeah,
it is the end, to change their minds, to put it positively, to appreciate the environment, to also help us think about how can we improve the harmony between nature, protect nature, and still uh, get our own needs fulfilled, our
yeah.
human needs, because naturally we need to look at both sides. We cannot just say, okay, nature is the most important thing now. It doesn't matter whether people here are starving. So we need to
Yeah, can't
find
do
a way
that.
together. And so, but it needs education. And
Now, I mean, we're getting towards the last few questions here, so you might feel you've already answered this, and you're obviously doing far more in your role for actually progressing conservation in your area. But if you had that little bit more power, that if you had that little more authority, or just the ability to snap your fingers, and you could change something to protect your environment, the environment of South America, or specifically your environment in Santa Lucia, what do you think that one thing would be? Would it be a physical thing, thing in people's minds? What would it be?
well, it would of course be people's minds. But let's not to in order to make this too much of magic. Magically, oh, everybody's an environmentalist now. Everybody helps
Yeah,
thinking
yeah,
along that. So I think if we were, let's say, a bigger scale, not only Santa Lucia, able to implement social standards in terms of education, healthcare, and maybe it's basic human rights, maybe it's a bit above that,
yeah,
and make them the same. So again, we come back to this point that nobody would be afraid of tomorrow anymore. Of even if they lose their job, that wouldn't be the end of the world. So that they are willing to do everything just to feed their families. If we could manage to install kind of a system that guarantees um, comfortable, not the minimal, comfortable social standards for everybody.
yeah.
Again, healthcare, free education, um, all these things. Then I think this would help. What would be the biggest help all over the world, not only in South
Absolutely,
America.
yeah. As we come to the last question, now obviously this is going out to my A level students, so they're all quite high ability A level biologists going off into their degrees, into their jobs, into their lives, and it's going to maybe other people will watch this as well. What message would you send to a young person who's finishing their schooling at this point in terms of what you'd like them to take with them into their adult and working lives regarding conservation?
Well, maybe something that I haven't done in my youth. It occurred to me only very late, but and maybe most of your students have done that already. Go into projects, go into social, educational, environmental projects with a certain goal. Look what's working, look what's not working, because many things in those projects can tell you lots of things that in the projects that I've been working here do not work. But get this experience as early as possible. Yeah, because this is something that will open your mind. It's not so. It's not like you have a textbook say this project runs and it runs well because of this. Get this experience kind of hands on. Yeah, go into those projects.
Definitely.
I say can be educational, can be healthcare, can be environmental, but not just being your own scientist running one particular thing where you work on your own. Where you have to work with people, maybe different approaches, community approach, whether it's a kind of government approach, to really see what's working, what not. So if humanity needs people that have this experience that are willing to work in these projects in the future to help us progress. And ideally,
Yeah.
of course, in this world where people know what solidarity is, where they know what harmony with nature is, because this is, I think, our only way forward. Yeah.
Yeah, a very wise words to end on, and
Thank you.
spoken in the most wonderful of settings of all these conversations. The hummingbirds buzzing around your head really
Yeah.
help to help to make your point perfectly. So thank you so much for getting involved with this. That's been really useful.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
What can I say? What great advice, eh? So as I say, do check out the extras. You've got a little taste there of some of the personal advice and some of the personal qualities about the leadership and working as a team on projects and learning from your mistakes and that kind of stuff in that video. You've got a little taste of that. There's far more on that and on South American and world politics and in the extras video. So I do recommend going and having a look there. Now, our next speaker is coming from the Northern Territories of Australia, and actually it's lovely and connected because I met our next speaker in the cloud forest of Ecuador and then went into the interior Amazon with him. Some of the photos in this video were his, as you will see from the credit on them. He's really one of the most intrepid people that I have ever worked with. Certainly fearless would sum him up. So look forward to that. Next up, Australia.